Okay, so here was the offer.
I will give $10,000 to the PLO in your name if you can find a historical fact in my book that you can prove to be false. I issue that challenge. I issue it to you. I issue it to the Palestinian Authority. I issue it to Noam Chomsky. I issue it to Edward Said. Every word in my book is accurate, and you can't just simply say it's false without documenting it. Tell me one thing in the book now that is false.
And that was Professor Alan Dershowitz debating the Institute for Public Accuracy's Sam Husseini on Scarborough Country. Well, the challenge has been put out there if anyone can find historical error in Alan Dershowitz's new book, The Case for Israel. And we're continuing our debate today between Professor Dershowitz, who is a law professor at Harvard Law School, and Norman Finkelstein, who teaches at DePaul University in Chicago and author of several books, including Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict and the Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering. Professor Dershowitz, on the second day, thanks for being with us and continuing this debate.
Well, let's summarize where we are now. Thus far, what Mr. Finkelstein has said is he's claimed that I correctly quoted Mark Twain and correctly quoted a great many other sources that also appear in the Peters book and Myth and Fact and many other books. Yes, that's absolutely correct. Second, he has found a possible typographical error in numbers that would, if it was an error, hurt my cause considerably. Now, whenever you argue that somebody makes an error, you always argue, and the errors always help your cause. When somebody makes an error that hurts his cause, when the true figures would have been 200,000 or 300,000, and if I had said 2 or 3 million, that would be a very serious charge. But reducing it by 100-fold, obviously, is either a typographical error which hurts my cause, or, and we're going to check the book, I was referring to a narrower time period. Third and finally, Mr. Finkelstein points out disagreements between my book, where I document what I say about Jenin, and what B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have said. Yes, we have a very serious disagreement here, and I urge people to read my chapter on Jenin, because I take the position that Jenin was a model of urban warfare, that in most other countries, in fact, there's an op-ed piece in the Times comparing what Israel did with Jenin with what other countries have done. Most countries would just drop a bomb. And Israel went in retail, lost 23 of its own soldiers, house-to-house fighting. The United States government has studied that house-to-house fighting in an effort to learn how to use implosion devices which bring down houses without damaging and hurting people. The same thing is true about torture. I stick to my very strong argument. I'm very proud of the Israeli judiciary and what it's done in trying to bring the issue of torture up to the surface, distinguishing between lethal torture, which nobody has ever accused Israel of using, and very rough interrogation techniques, which Israel is the only country in the world ever to have outlawed. And so I want to get to the last point that I really make major important point in the media, and that is, it's a central point in my book, that you hear all the time that Israel has killed as many as 2,500 Palestinians in the recent 3 years, and only about 900 Israelis have been killed. And that contrast is starkly made. And one of the major contributions I think I make in my book is to deconstruct those numbers and to point out that of the 2,500 Palestinians who've been killed, that includes the suicide bombers themselves. That includes collaborators who have been killed by other Palestinians. That includes people who have been blown up when bomb factories explode. It even includes people when Hamas has funerals and they shoot the guns up in the air, forgetting about Newton's law that the bullets will come down, the occasional person who's injured or killed there. I also point out that of the 900 Israelis who have been killed, more than 2,000 were actually kind of mortally wounded, but were saved by the incredible first efforts of Israeli emergency responders, and that as many as 10 times that number were attempted to be killed. For example, in the first 3 months of this year, there were no terrorist attacks in Israel, but Israel thwarted many such attacks. And when you do the comparisons, therefore, you have to compare, first of all, intended killings, targeted killings of civilians, with the incidental killings. Second of all, the numbers of civilians killed, many more Israeli civilians have been killed than Palestinian civilians. As my feminist colleague Phyllis Chesler, who's written a very good book called The New Anti-Semitism, has pointed out, many feminist groups have not noticed the fact that many more women have been killed, Israeli women than Palestinian women. Many more Israeli children have been killed. So it's crucially important when you look at gross figures, like the number of people killed, you don't just create one for one. When the FBI was fighting the Ku Klux Klan, we didn't expect the same number of Klan people to be killed. More terrorists are going to be killed, especially when terrorists quite deliberately hide among the civilian population, therefore telling essentially the Israelis, look, either you have to give a pass to the terrorists, don't go after them, or you have to risk killing civilians. One of the theses of my books is that every time a civilian is killed, the Palestinian movement benefits, whether it's a civilian on the Palestinian side or an Israeli civilian. And every time a civilian is killed, the Israeli side is hurt, because Israel suffers terribly when its own civilians are killed, but it also suffers terribly when it kills civilians. And as Golda Meir once said, we can perhaps forgive them for killing our children, but we can never forgive them for making us kill their children. And it's this kind of moral incompatibility between directly targeting civilians on the one hand, which is what Palestinian terrorist groups do, and what Israel and the United States does.
Okay.
That is trying desperately to kill the combatants, and in the course of that killing civilians, that Mr. Finkelstein completely ignores. And in his trivia of looking at trees and typos and the use of quotes that are multiple uses by many people, he fails to see the forest. And I'd like to get to the forest and talk about the morality on both sides of this issue.
Professor Norman Finkelstein.
I, too, want to get to the forest, especially when the forest is comprised of fraudulent trees, and the whole forest is a fake. Let's look at your book. You summarized the discussion so far as you cite one quote from Mark Twain, and Joan Peters cited one quote from Mark Twain. The quotes are correct, and what's the big issue?
They are correct, right?
Mr. Dershowitz, I gave you the time. Please show a little respect. Mm-hmm. In Chapter 1, footnote 10 from Joan Peters, footnote 11, footnote 12, footnote 13, footnote 14, footnote 15, footnote 16. All of the sources, you don't cite Joan Peters, even though all the quotes come right from her.
They come from
you
multiple
cite her,
sources.
no, sir.
I cite the sources. That's
right.
what you do.
No,
you cite the source directly.
We call
That's
that
what you always do.
Sir,
Professor
Mr. Dershowitz,
Dershowitz,
you have to let me speak.
But that's everybody.
Mr. Dershowitz, everybody who gets expelled from a university for lifting sources, that's what they do. They get expelled.
No.
That's the question of the sources. Now, on the question of,
are all correct,
let's go,
right?
Mr. Dershowitz, you have, Mr. Dershowitz says, no, Mr. Dershowitz, you know what,
Professor Dershowitz, I think that Norman Finkelstein is making.
I want to answer that question.
Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Dershowitz, the Joan Peters book was a hoax. What would you say about a scholar or a purported scholar who wrote a book on the Holocaust and then lifted whole cloth quotes from a Holocaust denier book?
First of all,
would you call that scholarship?
Let me answer that question.
Would you call it scholarship?
Let me answer the question. You can't repeat it 6 times and stop me from answering it. The Joan Peters book was not a hoax. The Joan Peters book was a serious attempt at serious scholarship, which Norman Finkelstein has
Find me one scholar who says that.
Has built a fraudulent career on trying to expose. It got excellent reviews in the New Republic. It got excellent reviews in a number of places. Joan Peters' book is a serious piece of scholarly work whose conclusions are disputed. Now, the fact nobody has ever claimed, not even Mr. Finkelstein, that she misquotes Mark Twain or misquotes Lloyd this or misquotes that. So, of course, it's perfectly appropriate to use her. She did a lot of research, and everybody has used some of her quotes. The quotes are appropriately used. You've missed the point.
This whole debate can end in 1 minute. It's very simple. Would you say your book is as serious a piece of scholarship as Joan Peters is?
My book is very different. My book is a
Would you say
piece...
it's of equal seriousness?
Well, let me make my point. Let me answer it. My book makes the case for Israel. That is, it tries to present responses to the arguments that are being made today on college campuses. It purports to be a resource guide for open-minded students on college campuses and people around the country who can turn to it, and when they hear professors or Norman Finkelstein or Noam Chomsky make allegations that Israel's a colonialist society, that it kills more Palestinians, that they can then turn to my book and they can find a compilation of sources, some of which obviously come from Peters, some of which come from other books, some of which, I mean, when you write a book like this, when you write a brief, what you do is you read a wide variety of books, you find quotes that are relevant, you check to make sure that they're accurate, and then you include them. That's
Professor
what I did.
Dershowitz, let's go to your point that on the issue of civilian casualties, that there are more Israeli civilian casualties.
Am I right about that? Am I right about that?
Let him address the point.
First of all, Mr. Dershowitz, let's look at your argument. The way you tried to prove that there are more Israeli civilian casualties, or that the numbers aren't accurately juxtaposed.
Right.
Your argument is this. You say that the numbers that are typically put forth, namely 4 times as many Palestinians were killed as Israelis killed, it ranges between 3 and 4 times depending on the moment. You state that those numbers don't include the terrorist attacks which were thwarted.
That's one of the arguments.
And then you go on to say, if we were to include the thousands who would have been killed,
that's one of the arguments.
Then the numbers change.
That's one of the arguments.
Okay, Mr. Dershowitz, let's use your logic.
Yeah.
According to Ma'arif, in the first
Israeli
3 weeks,
newspaper.
Israeli newspaper, in the first 3 weeks of the Second Intifada, Israelis spent 1 million shells. Now, by your argument, Mr. Dershowitz, we should count as a casualty every one of the shells that missed its target.
That's absurd.
That would, I know, it's absurd, like your argument.
Let me answer.
It's absurd, like your argument.
Let me make the difference here. Military, when they come in, they shoot. They shoot up in the air. They shoot for warnings. They shoot not intending to kill.
They just shoot in the air.
Of course, that's part of what you do when you're the military.
Celebrating a wedding.
You shoot in order to frighten. You shoot for a variety of reasons. Now, what we're talking about is the difference between somebody found with a belt entering into Jerusalem or entering into Tel Aviv, who's caught, who tries to detonate the belt, and the belt doesn't go off. That is a thwarted attempt. That's one of my arguments. My second argument is if you count equally civilian for civilian, the number of Israeli civilians who have been killed far exceeds the number of Palestinian civilians. If you count number for number, the number of women and the number of children, who are often good surrogates for civilianality, you find the numbers are far greater. When you exclude combatants and people who are terrorists from the number of Palestinians killed, the numbers change dramatically. Then I made one other point, and that is Palestinian Authority, whose leader, Yasser Arafat, has $300 million, according to Forbes, in a bank account, hasn't spent much money on first responders to attacks. For example, I document a number of instances where the Israelis have offered to fly by helicopter wounded people that have been wounded and civilians that have been wounded accidentally. The Israelis offer to fly them to the best hospitals in the entire Middle East. And for political reasons, at a particular point in time, the Palestinian Authority has turned down that offer and has caused the death of many of their own civilians as the result of loss of blood by not bringing them quickly enough to hospitals. These are all relevant factors. Now, you can disagree with them, you can argue.
Okay, respond to that point.
Mr. Dershowitz has lots of numbers in his book. What are his sources? Where does he get his numbers from?
The Boston Globe,
leaving aside the numbers he gets for demography, which are lifted whole cloth from Peters, let's look at his human rights sources. Does Mr. Dershowitz use human rights numbers? For his sources on civilian killings, we already know the answer to that question. Because according to Mr. Dershowitz, when the Human Rights Watch documents a man in a wheelchair being deliberately run down by a tank, according to Mr. Dershowitz and presumably his sources, that doesn't count as a civilian death.
Let me respond to that.
No, you have to let me finish.
Okay.
That's Mr. Dershowitz's sources. I looked carefully at his sources. I went through them one by one, very patiently, meticulously, and methodically. Almost all of his sources on these issues are Israeli official websites.
No, that's not
IDF
true.
sources.
That's not true.
Israeli Defense Forces sources.
No, that's just not true.
Yeah, I want to just pause for a moment on his sources. It's true. It's not always IDF.
No,
it's not always
rare.
It's not always official Israeli foreign affairs site. Listen carefully. Remember, this is a distinguished professor, a chair at Harvard Law School.
You said that a few times
yes,
now. It's
I know.
Some jealousy.
Yeah, I'm very envious. I'm very envious of those with your credentials who compose frauds. Mr. Dershowitz, you had an interesting observation. You mentioned that during Black September in 1970, King Hussein killed 4,000 Palestinians, between 3,000 and 4,000. That was an interesting number, and it jibed with what I was familiar with. But I always check sources. That's my little game in life. I turn to the back, listen carefully, so there can be no doubt about it. Listen to his source. This is a scholar. The first source is One Day in September, Sony Pictures, www.sonypictures.com.
It's also a book.
That's page 257, footnote 21.
It's also a book.
A Sony picture.
No, it's a book. September is a book. One Day in September is a book.
Sony Pictures. Number two, please listen carefully.
Right.
Some key dates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I checked that source. I spent some time. I'm not very computer literate, but I spent time tracking it down. You know what the source was? It was a chronology to a high school syllabus.
But,
serious?
But nobody disputes the
fact
that 3,000 to 4,000 people were killed. When you have an undisputed,
is that a serious source?
When you have an
chronology to a high school syllabus.
Let me ask you this question: do you dispute the conclusion?
We're talking about the kinds of sources you put forth. I didn't even have
to cite a source.
A Sony picture. Sony picture.
It's a book.
And a high school curriculum.
One Day in September is an important book that came out.
www.sonypictures.com/classic/one-day. Very serious source.
Because nobody disputes that.
I'm really humbled by that source.
Let me
all my scholarship pales in comparison to that source. Forget about the high school curriculum.
Let me respond to this.
Can we move on to
civilian casualties now? Now, in my civilian casualties, I argue that the number of civilian casualties killed among Israelis is much higher. There's no dispute about that. But Selim agrees with that. Human Rights Watch agrees with that. I don't know of a single organization that would disagree with that statistic. And so instead of taking me on the facts of my statistics, what you do is you say that, do you disagree that more Israeli civilians have been killed in the last 3 years than Palestinian?
In the last 3 years,
civilians?
Absolutely.
You do agree?
Absolutely disagree.
You disagree?
Combatants?
I'm talking about the difference between...
The difference in combatants?
No. Let me make my point very clear. There have been approximately 2,500 Palestinians and approximately 900 Israeli kills. Nobody disagrees with those figures. My argument, and there's no dispute about that, you don't need Israeli sources, is if you eliminate the number of terrorists, suicide bombers, collaborators, and combatants, and you just focus on, as the Boston Globe did, the number here, I'll read you from the Boston Globe, 18% of the nearly 2,000 Palestinians.
Could you please look at what you said? Who is the Boston Globe quoting?
They are quoting an internal analysis which they have of the IDF, have done
internal analysis. I read the book,
which they have done
you're in trouble.
But they have done an independent analysis.
You're quoting the IDF. Is that Selim?
By the way,
is the IDF that Selim?
Selim agrees with this figure.
Really? Can you please find that source?
But Selim agrees that the number of civilian casualties have been lower. Here's my point.
You say they agree with the IDF source.
I agree.
That's pretty scandalous.
The
shockingness of your falsifications is really breathtaking.
But Selim often agrees.
You don't want to read your source.
Given by the
I know every word in your book. You don't want to read your source. It's an IDF, an Israeli military source. That's his sources. Which the Boston Globe
and agreed
with.
The
Boston Globe analyzed the source.
Absolutely.
One lie after another. It's breathtaking.
Read the story.
It's breathtaking.
Read the story, and you will see that the Boston Globe stands behind those figures. Number one, number two. B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch do not disagree with these figures.
Yeah.
There is no reasonable dispute about the fact that more civilians have been killed among the Israeli 900 than among the Palestinian.
Oh, now we're
2,500.
changing it among the Israeli 900
That's what I
versus.
said.
We said whether
No,
there were
that's
more
what I
Israeli
said.
or Palestinian civilians killed in the last 3 years.
Here's my point. Let me make it again. 900 Israelis killed,
lawyer's trick.
2,500 Palestinians killed.
Yeah.
If you just look at the number of civilians, the number of Israelis among the 900 is greater than the number of civilians among the 2,500. That's what I say in my book. That's what I said from the beginning.
Mr.
If you
Dershowitz,
can't answer
a
something, you
simple
immediately say it's a
question.
lawyer's trick.
A simple
It is
question.
a fact.
Are you saying that according to the B'Tselem website, more Palestinian civilians, more Israeli civilians have been killed than Palestinian civilians?
Absolutely. And if you
don't start the discounting game.
No. Let me tell you what
This is not a bar. This is not a bazaar.
Of course,
I'm
it's not a
asking
bazaar.
you.
It's an attempt to
I'm
get at the
asking
truth.
you.
Keep it down.
And here's the truth. Here's the truth. If you take the Palestinian figure, now we have to have the same definitions, and you eliminate from the Palestinian
I asked you
figure
the B'Tselem website because it can be
talking about-
easily checked by anyone listening.
Check it out, and you'll see that there is nothing on the B'Tselem website that will disagree that if you take the 2,500 and you eliminate the suicide bombers, you eliminate the
6.
people who have been 6 suicide bombers. Wait a minute. Let's focus on this. 6 suicide bombers. Okay, we're talking about how many suicide bombers have produced the 900 deaths. You say it's 6.
I'm not saying 6.
No, you did say 6.
Mr. Dershowitz, we won't play that game.
It's not a
we
game.
won't play
I just
the
heard
game.
you say 6.
Let's look at the website. You said, according to the B'Tselem website, there are more Israeli civilians killed in the last 3 years than Palestinians killed.
B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, nobody will dispute that figure. I have never heard anybody dispute that figure before.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is whether the number of civilians, innocent civilians who have no in any way contact with terrorism, people who are like the mother, the daughter and her father, who are on a walk in Emek Rephaim, and on the night before her wedding, and who were blown up by Palestinian terrorists. If you compare the number of people like that on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, women and children and complete non-combatants, you will find that the number of Israeli casualties among civilians exceeds the number of Palestinian casualties among innocent civilians who are non-combatants and not involved in any way in terrorism and were killed by the Israelis, as distinguished from killed by Palestinian terrorists as collaborators. That is simply a fact. I know of no source that disputes that. I haven't heard Mr. Finkelstein dispute it. All he wants to do is focus on my sources without focusing on the truth and the conclusion of my arguments.
There's a very simple way for anyone to check this. B'Tselem has a breakdown of casualties on both sides, civilian and military.
Right.
Just go to the website.
Absolutely. I agree with that. And just see what their definition is.
Next point.
Right.
I didn't ask for their definition.
You have to make a definition of what is a combatant.
Right,
obviously.
they have a definition. And then they have the numbers.
And if you look at my book,
they have the numbers.
Look at my book, I make a very strong argument that there has to be a continua of civilianality.
Okay,
this is a concept that I introduced in my book, Why Terrorism Works, and it's a very important point, and that is the Geneva Accords define civilians in a certain way, and I think the world is now recognizing that the concept of civilianality is a continuum and is a matter of degree. And there's a big difference between the civilian just walking down the street, or the child, or the person coming from the Wailing Wall and being blown up in a bus, and people who harbor terrorists, people who support terrorists, people who encourage terrorists. Let me give you an example, and I give it in my book. There was a terrible rape that occurred in Massachusetts a few years ago, where some people raped a woman, some people held her down, some people cheered, some people blocked access, and some people simply refused to make the phone call that could have saved her lives. I think we all agree that every one of those people are morally accountable for the rape to a different degree. There are the rapists and there are the accessories. I make the same argument about terrorism. There are the people who wear the bomb. They're clearly the terrorists. There are the people who send them. They're clearly terrorists. There are the people like Mrs. Arafat who state that if she had a son rather than a daughter, she would train that son to be a suicide bomber. There are people who cheer and put up the posters. There are people who provide funds, like Saudi Arabia, to Hamas terrorists. We have a continuum of civilianality, and it's very important that as we look at the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, that we take that into account. I try very hard to make refined, sophisticated, nuanced arguments in my books about that. I don't need sources for that. That's my idea. That's my contribution to the debate. We haven't heard any response to that. All we've heard is little piddling claims that there's a cite for a statistic that nobody disputes, namely the number of people killed in Black September. And I cite a book called The One Day in September, which was also made into, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, an Oscar-winning film. And so, yes, I do cite all those statistics. Yes, I do cite statistics for that show that the number of people who were killed, for example, here, you look at the B'Tselem site. They say 396 were minors under the age of 18. Now, think about that statistic for a second.
Palestinians.
We now know that Palestinians...
We just pulled up the B'Tselem website on their casualties.
We now know that Palestinians are using younger and younger suicide bombers all the time. They are using kids as young as 13 and 14. They are using women. They are using pregnant women. It should come as no surprise that the number of people below the age of 18, say between 15 and 18, have increased dramatically. That doesn't tell us anything about whether they're combatants. I would ask Mr. Finkelstein, does the Israeli army have the right to shoot and kill a 15-year-old child who was wearing a suicide belt and a bomb belt and about to enter into a populated area? The answer is, of course they do. And B'Tselem would list that as somebody killed under the age of 18.
Okay.
So we're talking about something very different than talking about combatants and non-combatants. The number of combatants is what I'm talking about, not the number of combatants, whether they're 15 years old or 16 years old or 14 years old. It doesn't matter how old a child is when an adult has put a suicide belt around him. It's a tragedy. But the person responsible for the death of that 15-year-old is the person who gave him the suicide belt and not the person who shot him. Self-defense applies just as much to a 15-year-old as it does to an 18 or 19-year-old. And that's the point of the case for Israel. And I really urge people, now you've heard Finkelstein say he's read the book. Now you read the book. Read the book, read the footnotes, write to me. My email address is available. You tell me whether you agree with Finkelstein or whether you agree with me. Read the book, the whole book. Read the arguments and read the quotes that he says come from other sources. See if the quotes are inaccurate. Check them against the original. Look at the chapter on Jenin. See if you disagree. Read my analysis of how many people are killed. Read my analysis of Supreme Court decisions and tell me if you think I'm wrong, that if only the United States had a Chief Justice like Aaron Barak instead of William Rehnquist, that instead of the United States refusing to intrude in what's going on in Guantanamo today, if the United States took as its model the Israeli Supreme Court and looked hard at what was going on, whether or not you don't agree with me and think that the United States would be in a better situation. Look at the data about the number of people who were killed, whether they come from the Human Rights Watch, whether they come from Ma'ariv. Ask yourself whether Ma'ariv, that's very critical of Israel, Yediot Achronot, very critical of Israel, or Haaretz is very critical of Israel, has ever disputed the figures about the numbers of combatants versus non-combatants killed. And then ask the crucial question, the one crucial question, is there not a difference between targeting civilians, that is, picking them out and killing them because they're civilians, and going after combatants and in the process accidentally killing civilians? That is the key moral difference that makes a difference between a civilized society
Let me ask you a
question.
When a missile slams into a crowded civilian area and they say they are aiming for a Hamas leader and a number of Palestinians die, do you consider that the unintended consequences of that missile targeting the Hamas leader, or do you consider that a logical extension of aiming a missile at a crowded civilian area?
It's a very good question. I have a whole chapter, a whole section in my book on that, and I argue, in fact, my criticism of targeted assassinations is not that it's wrong as a matter of principle. If when Bill Clinton targeted Osama bin Laden for assassination, if he had only gotten him before 9/11, I think the world would have given him a Nobel Peace Prize. If, in fact, we could have gotten Saddam Hussein on the eve of the Gulf War and avoided this catastrophic war that we've gotten into, targeted assassination would be a good thing. Remember when we went after Saddam Hussein, we killed innocent people in the process. When we went after his sons, we killed innocent people in the process. When we went after the place he was supposed to be having lunch. My criticism of Israel is all too often they target people when they know there are going to be civilians around. And I disagree with that. That's wrong. But let's look at the last time they went after Hamas leader. They used a 500-pound bomb. There were those in the military who said, don't use a 500-pound bomb. You'll miss the head of Hamas. Use a 2-ton bomb. If they had used a 2-ton bomb, post-analysis said, well, they would have gotten the head of Hamas, who is a perfectly legitimate military target. They used a 500-pound bomb. Some people were injured and killed in the process. It was an attempt to be proportional. Proportionality is what military law calls for. One can be critical of Israel. By the way, all throughout my book, you haven't heard this from Mr. Finkelstein, I am critical of Israel. I'm critical of the occupation. I'm critical of the settlements. I'm critical of the overreaction often to terrorist attacks. I'm critical of targeted assassinations that bring about too many civilian casualties. But I insist still on making a distinction between targeting civilians deliberately and going after a combatant knowing that you're going to kill civilians.
May I answer that? I think I haven't had a chance to speak for about 10 minutes. May I answer that point?
Norman Finkelstein.
On page 146 of Mr. Dershowitz's book, he gives examples of how Israelis are careful not to target civilian casualties.
That's right.
Let me just read the paragraph. 3 stories illustrate the Israeli commitment to proportionality and to avoiding unnecessary civilian casualties. The first involves an Israeli attack directed against Salah Shahadeh, a leading Hamas commander who was responsible for hundreds of terrorist bombings. On several occasions, the army passed up opportunities to attack him because he was with his wife or children. Each time, Shahadeh's life was spared. He directed more suicide bombings against Israel. In other words, Israel was prepared to risk the lives of its own civilians in order to spare the lives of Palestinian civilians, including the wife of a major terrorist. Now, when I read that, I was kind of shocked. If Mr. Dershowitz knew who Salah Shahadeh was. Some people may remember in July 2001 or 2, can't remember now, the United States Israel dropped a 1-ton bomb on a civilian neighborhood in Gaza. They dropped a 1-ton bomb on the civilian neighborhood in Gaza, killing 9 children, in order to get who? In order to get Salah Shahadeh. The very person Mr. Dershowitz uses as an example of careful Israeli proportionality to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties.
That's exactly right.
Was the most shocking example to date of Israel, in order to kill a so-called terrorist leader, dropping it on a densely populated civilian neighborhood, a 1-ton bomb.
Okay, let me respond
That's
to that.
A very strange example.
That's a very good example. Let me respond to that. The Israeli military then did an analysis, and they discovered, of course, that when they dropped that bomb and killed those people, they had no idea that those people were in the building, and the people who made the decision to drop the bomb were criticized and disciplined for it. The point I make is when they knew for sure that family members were there, they withheld doing it. That doesn't deny the fact that on occasion they will accidentally make a decision that's wrong. The difference is between deliberateness, willfulness. Now, I know I was scheduled to be on until 9, and I have a 10 o'clock interview elsewhere, so we only have another 2 minutes.
That was a nice fairy tale. Dropping a 1-ton bomb on a densely populated civilian neighborhood in Gaza, and they had no idea that civilians would be there.
Well,
and then he goes on,
then he
goes on to fantasy number 2, that those who did it were disciplined. Really, Mr. Dershowitz? I'd love the evidence for that. I mean, if I could get $10,000 for every one of your fraudulent statements, I could be rich not only for this life, but, even though I don't believe in an afterlife, for 10 lives to come.
Well,
every word out of your mouth is sheer fraud.
So far, we've had an hour and 45 minutes, and again, we've come up with.
Here comes the lawyer's summary. Prepare.
Right, a full quote that correctly quoted from Mark Twain, a possible typo. Disagreements with various organizations, and mostly, by the way, agreements with me about conclusions, but disagreements about whether or not I use this source or that source. I mean, so far, I think I'm maybe prepared to raise the offer now, because I've now gotten the most rigorous. I really appreciate, first and most things. Thank you for reading my book so carefully. I really appreciate that. I like people reading my book carefully. I urge others to read it carefully. I acknowledge. By the way, I found another mistake. When I described the man who Yasser Arafat personally ordered the murder of an American diplomat in the Sudan in the early 1970s, I got his name wrong. Yes, I did. I called him Cleo something or other, and he was Cleo something or other. Yes, you're going to find, any time a book is written, you're going to find a couple of typos. I maintain again, I did not make a willful, material misstatement of fact. I disagree with B'Tselem. I disagree with some human rights organizations. I agree with a lot of what they say, but the main thrust of my point is agreed to by the vast majority of Israelis, and I want to emphasize that I'm not making the right-wing case for Israel. I'm not making the conservative case. I'm making the case that Michael Walzer makes for Israel. I'm making the case that Shimon Peres makes for Israel. I'm making the case...
I agree with that.
...that Amnon Rubinstein makes for Israel.
For sure.
I'm making the two-state solution
case. The case that Joan Peters makes.
No. And we have to understand that Norman Finkelstein stands at the extreme of the case against Israel, against the two-state solution, against resolving these issues. So we're having a mainstream Israeli case made versus an extremist case that almost nobody in Israel, not the Palestinian Authority, accepts. And the best prospect for peace in the Middle East is going to be a two-state solution. And I'm going to end the way I started. When the Palestinian leadership wants their own state, standing side by side with Israel, there will be a two-state solution. But so long as they want to see the destruction of the Israeli state more than they want to see their own state, which has been true
Alan
since
Dershowitz, I'm going to interrupt only because
you're
going to have to leave, and since we gave you that opportunity at the beginning to sum up your main points, I'm going to give Norman Finkelstein the conclusion to an audience most of whom have not read this book in terms of the general points.
Well, I think the obvious point is it's no more possible to have a debate with Mr. Dershowitz about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and it's possible to have a discussion with a Holocaust denier about the Nazi Holocaust. The book he wrote, or purports to have written, and I hope because I hope you haven't.
But you
I hope you haven't written the book, but you have to let me finish. You had 5 minutes. You had 5 minutes. You had 5 minutes. Allow me to finish.
Purports to written.
Mr. Dershowitz, just an aside note, you say you had some input in UN Resolution 242.
Right.
Now, if somebody had some input into UN Resolution 242, you have to have known who the main framers were.
Absolutely.
They were Arthur Goldberg.
Who was my boss.
And who was the second?
He was my law clerk.
Who was the second?
Oh, I think his name was Lord Shawcroft, the British ambassador.
Yeah, Lord who?
I don't remember.
Right, you had input.
Yeah,
1967. I know, Mr. Dershowitz.
He cited in my book.
I know he cited. And you know who you cite?
Right.
You cite Lord Carrington.
Yeah,
but you know what, Mr. Dershowitz? Right. It was Lord Carradine. You don't even know who you're talking about.
Oh,
you don't have the vaguest idea.
Was my dear friend.
I know. You had input
on the phone.
You had input in the resolution, and you have no idea who the person is. He says Lord Shawcroft here. He says in my book is Lord Carrington. You said you had input
with Arthur Goldberg. I was very clear. Arthur Goldberg was my friend. He called me. He was the UN ambassador. He asked me advice about this. I had no contact with any lords from Britain, obviously. All I had contact with was Arthur Goldberg. That's all I claim. Okay. That's the fact.
If you can finish your conclusion.
True.
Okay. As I said, you cannot have a discussion about the Nazi Holocaust with a Holocaust denier.
That's right.
You can't have a discussion about the Israel-Palestine conflict with somebody who didn't produce a hoax, who plagiarized one. You can't have a serious discussion on that topic. That's number one. Number two, Mr. Dershowitz says, I'm on the extreme end.
You are.
He's in the mainstream.
Right.
I hope people will listen to the evidence. He cited a hoax. I cite the scholarly sources. Mr. Dershowitz says he doesn't agree with the human rights organizations.
On some issues.
I quote B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International,
and so do
and
I,
if I
by the
had
way.
the time, you quote them to dismiss them.
No, sometimes I agree
No,
with them.
Mr. Dershowitz, I read your book.
Sometimes
I think
agree
I
with
know
them.
your
You
book
see,
better
I
than you
sometimes
do.
agree with them.
Let
I'm
him
sure you
finish
do.
his conclusion.
Finish.
Let him finish his conclusion.
I quote the mainstream sources, the mainstream numbers. He quotes internal investigations of the IDF and hoaxes. But I'm the
B'Tselem is not a
extremist.
mainstream
But
number.
I'm the extremist. But I'm the extremist. Mr. Dershowitz then throws in another lie. He says, oh, Finkelstein, he's an extremist. He doesn't support the two-state settlement. I've been, my entire adult life, I've been involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict. I started publishing on the topic in 1984. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the topic in 1988. I lecture about 2 or 3 times a week on the topic. I'd like you to show me a statement where I say don't support the two-state settlement.
Which
I'd like
two
to
states?
see the statement.
Do you support
Mr.
the
Dershowitz,
existence? Let me ask you the question.
Yeah.
Do you support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state?
Well, you see, now you throw in as a Jewish state.
That's the two-state
I support
settlement
the
that
right of
everybody has talked about.
the right of Israelis to self-determination in the borders before the pre-June 1967 borders.
And
I support the right of the Palestinians to self-determination in the territories occupied by Israel in the June 1967 war. According to the internationally understood concept of the two-state settlement, which has been ratified over and over again in the United Nations for the past 20 years now, that's what's meant by a two-state settlement.
No, it's
now,
not.
Mr. Dershowitz,
No, everybody
you
acknowledges
said,
some
you
changes
said
in the border, the
please.
242 borders.
You said I don't support a two-state settlement. Could you provide the evidence for that?
You don't support the kind of two-state
The kind
settlement
of.
that is today's consensus, which means that Israel has the right to define its own existence and to create borders consistent not with the pre-1967 lines, which Abba Eban, who was a great dove, called the Auschwitz lines, but rather with 242. 242, there was a great debate, you'll recall, about whether to use the word the territories rather than territories. There was even a discussion about what the official language was, because as you know, in French you can't say easily and grammatically. And that
Okay, why don't you answer that?
Mr. Dershowitz,
we have to wrap this up.
I'm familiar with the great debate on UN Resolution 242.
Yeah.
I've written on the topic. I went through the entire UN record on UN Resolution 242, the General Assembly debates in July, and then the Security Council debates at the end of the year. Now, Mr. Dershowitz, you have a lot to say about UN Resolution 242.
Yeah.
You even talk about who framed it, Lord
right.
Carrington.
Justice Goldberg.
Yeah, I checked your footnote. He has a long discussion on 242. Do you know what his footnote is? On the framing of 242, about which books have been written. I've read 3 full volumes on 242.
I was there.
Do you know what his footnote is? An editorial in the Orlando Sentinel in the year 2000.
I was
That's
there.
scholarship?
No, I was there.
You were there. I
remember
know, Lord
what happened.
Shawcroft.
No, I was there with Justice Goldberg. I was his law clerk. I spent a year with him. We were intimate
Orlando Sentinel?
and close friends. We discussed this. I read all the papers leading up to 242. Again, you
On
don't
that note.
disagree with me on 242.
Okay.
You just don't like my citation of authority.
Orlando Sentinel,
The
a citation of
tragedy is
authority.
that what could
You're
have
a
been-
joke.
The
You're a
tragedy
bad
is
joke.
what could have been a great debate, an interesting debate about the future of the Middle East, ends up being a debate about whether or not you can cite the Orlando Sentinel for a proposition that nobody disputes. And that's just a trivialization.
What he wrote and what he
of all
cited
of our
from the
time. I think
Orlando
you've
Sentinel
insulted
is a flat-out
the intelligence.
fraud. He quoted the Orlando
Do you
Sentinel.
disagree that
Sir,
242
Mr.
left out the words,
Dershowitz,
the article the?
Mr. Dershowitz, regrettably for you, I read the book.
I wish
You
everybody
cited
did.
the Orlando Sentinel for a statement by Lord Carrington, or you call Lord Carrington, Lord Carradine, which was a flat-out fraud. You have no idea what Lord Carradine said. I read the original documents. I have them at home. You got the name wrong. You got the evidence wrong. You had an absurd source. Your whole book is
The
ridiculous.
conclusion is, of course, correct that the word "the" does not appear in the word before the word "territories."
That's not
That
what the citation was
done
about.
for a very
Oh,
good
no.
reason, because the contemplation was that Israel who won a defensive war in 1967 and gave back the Sinai Peninsula. Almost no other country has ever given back land captured in a defensive war. That Israel was entitled to make small territorial adjustments. That's my conception of the two-state solution. That was Otto Goldberg's conception. That was the United States' conception. That was the United Nations' conception.
Do you disagree with that?
Only speak 2 hours extemporaneously
and you come
on
to
them.
the same conclusion
Let's go to the facts. Mr. Dershowitz, I'm going to get to it right now, Mr. Dershowitz. You cite UN Resolution 242. You very conveniently leave out the preambular paragraph.
No, I don't. It's in there.
No, sir.
It's in there.
Sir, I hope this is not going to be another falsehood.
I
said you left out the preambular paragraph to 242, which says that given that the acquisition of territory by war is inadmissible under international law. You left that out. But Mr. Dershowitz,
and you leave out
Mr. Dershowitz,
the key, not preambular paragraph, the one that says that Israel has to give back land only in exchange for peace.
I'm talking about your book.
Yeah.
You left out in your rendering, even though you quoted 242, you left out the crucial preambular statement which said, given that it's inadmissible under international law to acquire territory by war, Lord Carradine at the UN then pointed to that paragraph, and he said, if you put that preambular paragraph with the operative paragraphs of UN 242, it calls for a full Israeli withdrawal with one provision. On the Jordanian border, there can be, because the Jordanian border was irregular, there can be minor and mutual territorial adjustments. Minor and mutual. If you go through the foreign relations of the United States annual book, they have the record on the U.S. position. The U.S. position was it was incidentally also Goldberg's position in 1967.
20 seconds.
Minor and mutual adjustments within the context of a full Israeli withdrawal.
Now,
I know 242.
No, you don't.
You don't know you don't know 242 from 195. You have no idea what you're talking about.
You have left out the key provision of 242, which says that Israel's giving back of the land is conditioned on, quote, termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect for acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity of all groups. Right after that, at Khartoum, the Arabs gave their 3 no's.
I'm not going to Khartoum now.
No to
I'm not going to Khartoum.
And no to negotiation.
I'm looking at the UN resolution 242.
What I'm saying is
we're leaving it there.
242 was never accepted by the Palestinian side or the Arab side. It was accepted immediately by the Israeli side. And Israel has completely complied with 242. Every time it's made peace, it's given back land to Egypt.
He has no idea what he's talking about.
To Jordan.
On that note, I want to thank you both.
Would you like me to comment on that? Israel did not accept formally 242. Okay, no? Then let's stop.
Okay, we're leaving it at that, and I want to thank you both very much for being with us. Norman Finkelstein, author of The Holocaust Industry and Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, and Alan Dershowitz, who has a new book out. It's called The Case for Israel. Thanks both.
Thank you very much.